Today's very important episode has the very important task of discussing the impact of climate on national security, with a spotlight on how national intelligence fits into this bigger picture. And I guess while it may not be immediately obvious that climate change, in fact, has a lot to do with national security, by the end of this episode, the connections will hopefully be much more clear to you. The ISGP has been fortunate enough to convene a series of 3 meetings in partnership with the United States Army War College on this climate/national security theme. And these programs have attracted some of our most prestigious presenters and debaters ever, including retired military officials of the highest ranks, representatives from each branch of the armed forces, plus the U.S. emergency response community.
So, the conference series Aubrey is talking about was called, appropriately, Climate Impact on National Security, and was held during several months spanning late 2016 into mid 2017.
And the debate we'll cover today occurred at the very first meeting of this series. The report in question was written by Dr. Rod Schoonover of the National Intelligence Council. His report was titled, of course, Implications of Climate Change for National Security.
It's getting redundant, isn't it? So before we begin, it might be helpful to clarify that the term national security involves not just defense, both domestically and overseas, physical and virtual, but it also includes maintaining some broader interests of the country, such as economic and energy security. And since we like to give things a policy spin here on the forum, this means that national security implicates defense policy, foreign policy, and other related policy arenas.
Keeping this definition in mind, the nature of national security doctrine generally addresses threats on a relatively short timescale, anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of decades. And while to most teenagers this would seem like practically an eternity, this is really just a wrinkle in time compared to the type of projections we talk about when it comes to climate science.
And that's a serious disconnect, as Dr. Schoonover lets it be a given conclusion that climate change is a national security threat that's growing.
And it seemed like a foregone conclusion on the part of the debaters as well. With that established, Dr. Schoonover then laid out 3 classes of stresses imposed by climate that will foreseeably impact our ability to maintain national security. So let's mention them each in turn.
Right. So first we have single or isolated extreme weather events, which would include, heavy rains, heat waves, storms, and droughts. So those are the physical problems, and the physical outcomes of these problems could include crop failures, infrastructure destruction, energy blackouts, infectious disease outbreaks, or even supply chain failures. And thinking back on that definition of national security, I'm sure you can start imagining how some of these outcomes could hurt our economic prospects or even our ability to feed people. More on this later.
The second class of stresses involves clusters of extreme weather events. So while Aubrey's case scenario could be a single hurricane, for instance, this one could involve multiple hurricanes or tropical storms hitting the same region within a relatively short period of time. This is pretty intense because it's predicted that clusters of moderately severe weather events could actually have a greater overall impact than a single extremely severe event.
And finally, the third class is diffuse climatological stress, which is just a fancy way of describing phenomena such as sea level rise, ocean acidification, poor air quality, cloud cover alterations, and sustained changes in temperature or precipitation patterns.
And with these stress classes as context, Dr. Schoonover asserts that climate will undoubtedly impact the national security interests of the United States over the next 20 years. And that's not even considering security impacts felt by other nations around the globe. So let's talk about these security impacts, shall we?
Yeah, well, there are certainly a lot of them. To start, climate-related stresses will almost certainly threaten the stability of countries. Whether it be through natural disasters or famine or some other impact, countries will have a harder and harder time adapting. The end result? Well, migration of people from one area to another as an attempt to cope with the problem. That's the end result. So unsurprisingly, migration was a major outcome discussed in Dr. Schoonover's paper.
Right. In scenarios where availability of food and shelter can't meet the demands of the existing and migrating populations, migrations can be particularly destabilizing.
This climate-related instability will be exacerbated in countries having weak political infrastructure, poor economies, or social strife. And before we go any further, the debaters noted that it's actually really challenging to pinpoint the quote unquote weak states that could quickly turn to failed states if certain climate issues manifest, making preparation or anticipation of this instability even more challenging.
The U.S. national intelligence community is responsible for analyzing the stability of nation states, mostly using academic research and a political instability task force. Once established, instability in other countries can place huge demands on foreign aid, disaster response, or even military action. These demands could easily be placed on the US or some other country.
And this is kind of the worst case scenario, drawing on other nations for help. At best, which is still not even remotely good, governments of nations in peril could be forced to spend so much time dealing with climate issues that they have little time or resources to spend on other policy issues. And we know that there are many policy issues that need attention per our previous 49 podcast episodes.
For
Right.
sure.
And even if issues like migration don't become severe, heck, even if they do, Dr. Schoonover points out that water shortages and access to or ownership of farmland will likely increase the risk of conflicts arising between people.
Especially if those people share river basins, aquifers, or land access. And this wasn't mentioned in the debate, of course, but if you recall episode 37 of the forum, we talked about how the Colorado River Basin, for instance, is tapped by several US states as a water supply, plus Mexico. Just to give you a little context and real world setting for this hypothetical.
Plus, we have to remember that these environmental related issues won't be the only problems people face. So, we're not really saying here that people are going to start calling dibs over land and then fight each other when the all powerful dibs rule is ignored. But we are saying that this plus other everyday issues could surely increase conflict potential.
In other words, it's fueling the fire.
Then again, even if food and water stresses don't lead to conflict, they could lead to our new favorite catchphrase, migration, thereby exacerbating social and political tensions. Basically, when people are forced to move against their will, or causing them to encounter new people, or making the newly encountered people angry because, personal bubbles, am I right? Anyway, it's going to make people mad.
Okay, but here's my real question. Migration. So this obviously involves people moving from one place to another. And we know that some climate-related issues, like sea level rise, are already happening and causing coastal flooding and enormous storm surge, among other things. So people know this, and what's their response? Well, in general, they're not moving. They're not migrating. Hence the discussion topics of forum episodes 20, 22, 25, 28, 31.
Literally all of those. She's not just spouting off numbers here.
So my point is, if people aren't migrating now, what makes us think that they'll migrate in the future?
Fair question. The difference is that sudden extreme weather events like floods and droughts will forcibly displace people because staying put could literally be impossible. And not just on the Jersey Shore, Florida coast, or in New Orleans, aka the areas that are becoming accustomed to these sorts of disasters.
Yeah, so now these are regions that aren't prepared to handle these events that we're talking about. Rising sea levels, like you mentioned, Dee, and associated storm surges could start actually putting small islands and coastal regions straight up underwater, including many megacities.
So we're starting to invoke those maps that we've all seen, which show the entire eastern coastline of the US completely underwater.
Yeah, unfortunate too, because, contrary to popular belief, New Jersey's not such a bad place.
I don't know if I would go that far.
Yeah, I'll
Rude.
believe it when I see it, Aubrey. But the stock of the US East Coast makes me think about conflict, migration, food shortage, and the like within a country. But I imagine these things could just as easily occur between countries, right?
Well, yeah, once again, we can call back to different countries straddling the same aquifer, for instance, or we can think about something a little different, like when countries adopt different strategies for warding off these climate stresses to begin with.
A prime example is actually a nation's hypothetical decision to embrace geoengineering. If, say, one country decided to test or deploy certain geoengineering technologies on its own, it could certainly heighten international tensions.
Okay, but Why, though? Aren't climate change mitigation strategies beneficial all around?
Well, here's the thing. Not all strategies are condoned by all parties, and geoengineering is a prime example. Proposed GeoE techniques, all still in the testing phase, range from trapping CO2 underground to injecting aerosols into the stratosphere to placing solar radiation reflective devices in space.
Just as a note, if you're interested in learning more about this, check back in with us here at the forum in September for our next virtual conference, GeoE Live. It's on the subject of, obviously, geoengineering, science, and regulation, and you'll find all the info on our Facebook and Twitter pages, so check it out.
But in the context of today's conversation, there are a lot of uncertainties and concerns surrounding geoengineering, especially regarding unintended consequences. And if one nation decides to test or deploy it without working within multinationally established governance frameworks,
Sure, okay, I get it. Conflict.
exactly. Well, especially because things like GeoE affect everyone. It's not something you can just perform in isolation.
Two other things we can't consider in isolation are food and human health, both of which are also inextricably linked with the climate picture. We've already kind of touched on these, but so far we've only used them to feed our discussion on migration. That's definitely not the only place they appear in this conversation.
Wait, though, is it just me, or does this episode, and I mean, I guess Dr. Schoonover's entire debate, like really manage to weave every major ISGP theme ever into one cohesive conversation? We've got, let's see, climate, food security, water scarcity, public health. I guess what's the only thing we're missing? Science communication?
Well, we are having this discussion via podcast, so in a meta sense, we've got that one covered too.
Nice.
I'll always associate this conference with communication and podcasting, though. I mean, it was the first time the three of us co hosts were in the same room together.
Oh, well, technically the second, but it was the first time since the podcast was started.
How about the first time since I started working for the ISGP? The very first time we were all in the same place was about a month before I became one of your interns, Aubrey.
Wow, that's actually crazy. I completely
Right.
forgot about that.
Okay, no, what was crazy was you, Aubrey, making us wake up at like 5 a.m. during the Army War College conference to take photos before the debate started. I was
Hey,
so cranky.
it was for advertising. Who knows the next time we'll all be together again? Seriously.
Okay, guys. But food and health and climate change, remember? That's why we're here.
Fine, okay, I'll reminisce on my own time. So, in terms of food production and availability, more frequent or even just unexpected droughts and deluges would seriously impact our ability to grow food. This is obviously bad for humanity, but it's also significant in terms of economic losses.
And it's not just agriculture that's at risk. Livestock production is affected both directly and indirectly by climate stresses. In the direct sense, heat waves can put animals' lives in danger at the very worst, and at best, cause reduced fertility, decreased milk production, and increased susceptibility to disease. Once again, it's pretty sad that that's considered at best.
Yeah, you're not kidding. And then indirectly, livestock production is threatened by the fact that pasture and feed supplies decrease with droughts and wildfire.
Wait, do we consider fish to be livestock?
I mean, probably not traditionally, but they are farmed. Why?
Well, I guess it doesn't really matter what we consider them, because the fact of the matter is that fisheries are seriously impacted by these stressors too. Not only are many fisheries already in jeopardy because of pollution, but now we can add increasing ocean temperatures and frequent intense storms to the list of threats to our finned food friends.
And that, my friends, was me forcing Daniela to say some ridiculous alliteration because it's one of my favorite things to do and listen to, and I wouldn't forgive myself if I didn't do it during our 50th episode. So there's that.
So cruel, as if my pronunciation is not already the butt of all jokes during our recording sessions.
Well, thank you for, indulging me, Daniela. In all seriousness, though, that's not the end of the problems for fisheries. We can't forget about ocean acidification, aka the topic of my high school science fair project senior year, which I'm sure you all care about, which is occurring with greater frequency as the ocean dissolves CO2 from the air. Acidification can seriously affect ocean ecosystems, harming fish and other sea creatures, of course.
So, yes, ocean health is at risk, but so is human health. I know, right? You never thought you could link climate to your health, did you? Well, I personally didn't at first. I mean, I'm sick all the time anyway. That's mainly why I sound like a different person on
Or like
pretty
a dying whale?
okay, on pretty much every episode of the forum. And that was kind of rude.
That was a bit harsh, Aubrey,
Uh,
but
but it turns out that extreme heat, according to Dr. Schoonover, will increasingly contribute to cardiovascular and respiratory illness deaths around the world, especially considering the elderly.
Oh, but that's certainly not the only health impact. Sea level rise and extreme weather events are bound to threaten medical infrastructure and services.
and elevated temperatures, increasing rainfall, and flooding will increase certain water and vector-borne diseases. Diseases carried by insects, snails, and other cold-blooded species would be on the rise. Disease transmission seasons would lengthen, and geographical reach of said diseases would likely grow.
So, in episode 43, we talked about climate causing lengthier fire seasons in California. And here we're talking about climate causing lengthier disease seasons anywhere there's water and bugs. Okay, awesome.
That's the spirit, and nice callback to episode 43. That might actually be one of my favorites. In any case, the social instability, migration potential, water scarcity, decrease in food production, and now human health risks we've discussed today all exist under the umbrella of national security concerns. And when you think of national security, or this conference being held at, the Army War College, the military and national emergency response management probably come to mind. But it turns out that the armed forces have their own challenges when it comes to climate stressors.
That's right, not even the military is immune to this problem.
So, like we mentioned at the top of the show, more natural disasters around the world will put strain on the US armed forces and the forces of our allies to come in and provide disaster and humanitarian relief.
And the US forces could end up being called upon more frequently to respond to crises abroad if our usual counterparts find themselves outstretched in terms of manpower and resources. I mean, our allies, just like us, are going to have their own climate and natural disaster related problems to deal with at home.
Plus, there's the fact that military facilities and equipment are likely to be threatened by sea level rise, flooding, drought, and every other climate stressor we've mentioned 50 times today. This will affect our military bases here on US soil and abroad, and even military training.
And as soon as you start invoking the term military, now you get people wondering about defense and intelligence, which is where the national intelligence community really comes into our conversation today.
In the United States, there's definitely a divide between international and domestic climate related intelligence. When it comes to monitoring the stability of nation states, definite channels for collecting and reporting this information exist.
An example of such a channel is the Global Trends Report, an unclassified document written every 4 years by the National Intelligence Council, which outlines the biggest trends and uncertainties that could impact the world over the next 20 years.
Right. And like Cleo said, these efforts at establishing an international scope do exist. But the debaters believe that we lack a constant flow of information to policymakers regarding climate impacts in the US. In the spirit of problem solving, they did suggest finding a way to coordinate this information flow across multiple US government agencies so that no one department is stepping on the toes of another.
Harnessing the expertise and talents of agencies ranging from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, aka FEMA, to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, was definitely a favorite idea amongst debaters. So this doesn't necessarily place the intelligence community in the lead, does it?
Well, no. The debaters didn't seem convinced that the intelligence community would even be appropriate to take the lead here, though they definitely weren't opposed to its involvement, maybe as one of the departments having a seat at the climate security table.
Well, right. There was a huge question about how to even fit climate research and discussions into the intelligence community as a whole. This is kind of new territory and was identified by debaters as an operational challenge, probably because climate basically exacerbates or impacts other areas traditionally explored by the intelligence folks.
These traditional areas addressed by the intelligence community include topics like humans as disease vectors, water scarcity related conflict, and political instability.
And because of this, within the intelligence community, climate wouldn't necessarily need to be its own thing. It could rather be treated as an influencer of sorts, or it could, be its own thing. Really, that remains to be decided.
The debaters acknowledged that the primary focus of the intelligence community is counterterrorism. But they themselves discussed the need to broaden this focus, and they said we could start by expanding the scope of security priorities outlined by both the National Security Council and the President.
But the current US president's list of national security priorities does not include climate, which might leave you concerned after listening to the laundry list of climate-related problems we've spent 3/4 of this episode outlining.
The debaters acknowledged that despite this reality, there are many climate change caucuses that meet pretty regularly in Senate. Plus, governors and mayors of many states and cities have been active in conversations about how to best address climate-related stressors in their regions.
That is so true. One of the biggest take-home messages for me from this conference was actually the debaters' insistence on further engaging governors in climate action plans. And we've actually seen governors and mayors be really active on this front lately. Many of them declaring that, they'll strive to meet the Paris Climate Agreement goals despite the United States pulling out as a nation.
And on a related note, debaters stress that we need some sort of continuity across presidential administrations when it comes to addressing climate. This does not necessarily have to take the form of similar ideologies across incoming and outgoing presidents either.
Yeah, ideally, Congress would be on board with addressing these issues, especially if they're framed in the context of national security implications or even threats to our military.
And speaking of the military, having the attention and commitment of the Joint Chiefs of Staff would probably help provide this continuity too.
Oh, absolutely. I can't think of a generally more well-respected group of people.
So, despite the fact that we've got a million reasons to be concerned about climate change from a national security standpoint, we have ideas about how to meet the challenges.
Just to recap, it seems clear that climate change will either cause, exacerbate, or increase the frequency of natural disasters such as severe storms, drought, and flooding over the course of the future. These disasters will inevitably lead to food production difficulties, water scarcity, and associated issues of migration, social unrest, and political instability.
So that's why we really need to start addressing or at least planning for these challenges now, before they arise with more vigor than we've ever seen before.
The national intelligence community, U.S. military, and a variety of government departments and organizations have roles to fill in helping us adapt to a more climate insecure world.
And that, my friends, was the 50th episode of ISGP's The Forum.
In the words of Elle Woods, we did it.
Great job, guys. I'm really proud of us.
Well, here's to 50 more. Thank you so much to our listeners for tuning in for 50 episodes and learning about food, disease, and of course, climate change along with us. And we can't wait for you to see what we have planned for our new upcoming episodes, including guest co-hosts, new episode topics of international importance, literally, and more virtual conferences that you can attend online.
Yes, I am so amped for what we're about to do next.
As am I, and we're super excited to have you with us next 50 episodes.
The three of us are clearly super stoked. As always, please feel free to interact with us on social media about today's episode.
And if you don't know it by now, you should. Our Twitter handle is @ISGP Forum, and our Facebook page can be found by heading on over to facebook.com/ISGP Forum.
We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts about today's conversation on the role of national intelligence in the climate stressor equation.
Well, there you have it. On behalf of Cleo, Daniela, myself, of course, and everyone here at the Institute on Science for Global Policy, thank you so much for socializing with science and celebrating our 50th episode with us today. We'll catch you next time right here on the forum. The Institute on Science for Global Policy, or ISGP, is a nonprofit organization that convenes international meetings bringing together scientists, policymakers, industry leaders, students, and other stakeholders to discuss pertinent scientific issues facing society. The ISGP has no opinions and does not lobby. Therefore, the preceding podcast reflects the views expressed by the presenters and debaters at our conference. For more information, please visit our website at www.scienceforglobalpolicy.org. Thank you. Security. I'm sure you can start imagining how some of these outcomes could hurt our economic prospects or even our ability to feed people. More on this later. The second class of stresses involves clusters of extreme weather events. So while Aubrey's case scenario could be a single hurricane, for instance,
This one could involve multiple hurricanes or tropical storms hitting the same region within a relatively short period of time. This is pretty intense because it's predicted that clusters of moderately severe weather events could actually have a greater overall impact than a single extremely severe event.
And finally, the third class is diffuse climatological stress, which is just a fancy way of describing phenomena such as sea level rise, ocean acidification,
Schoonover lets it be a given conclusion that climate change is a national security threat that's growing.
and it seemed like a foregone conclusion on the part of the debaters as well. With that established, Dr. Schoonover then laid out 3 classes of stresses imposed by climate that will foreseeably impact our ability to maintain national security. So let's mention them each in turn.
Right. So first we have single or isolated extreme weather events, which would include, heavy rains, heat waves, storms, and droughts. So those are the physical problems, and the physical outcomes of these problems could include crop failures, infrastructure destruction, energy blackouts, infectious disease outbreaks, or even supply chain failures. And thinking back on that definition of national solves not just defense, both domestically and overseas, physical and virtual, but it also includes maintaining some broader interests of the country, such as economic and energy security. And since we like to give things a policy spin here on the forum, this means that national security implicates defense policy, foreign policy, and other related policy arenas.
Keeping this definition in mind, the nature of national security doctrine generally addresses threats on a relatively short timescale, anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of decades. And while to most teenagers this would seem like practically an eternity, this is really just a wrinkle in time compared to the type of projections we talk about when it comes to climate science.
And that's a serious disconnect, as Dr.
And debaters ever, including retired military officials of the highest ranks, representatives from each branch of the armed forces, plus the U.S. emergency response community.
So the conference series Aubrey is talking about was called, appropriately, Climate Impact on National Security, and was held during several months spanning late 2016 into mid-2017.
And the debate we'll cover today occurred at the very first meeting of this series. The report in question was written by Dr. Rod Schoonover of the National Intelligence Council. His report was titled, of course, Implications of Climate Change for National Security.
It's getting redundant, isn't it? So before we begin, it might be helpful to clarify that the term national security involves Today's very important episode has the very important task of discussing the impact of climate on national security, with a spotlight on how national intelligence fits into this bigger picture. And I guess while it may not be immediately obvious that climate change, in fact, has a lot to do with national security, by the end of this episode, the connections will hopefully be much more clear to you. The ISGP has been fortunate enough to convene a series of 3 meetings in partnership with the United States Army War College on this climate/national security theme. And these programs have attracted some of our most prestigious presenters